There's a verse in the Bible that most pastors skip right over. It's tucked inside Deuteronomy chapter 3, sandwiched between land surveys and tribal allotments. The kind of passage your eyes glaze over during a read through the Bible in a year plan. But this verse describes something that, if you actually stop and think about it, is one of the strangest details in all of Scripture. It describes a bed, an iron bed. And this bed is 13.5 feet long and 6 feet wide. Think about that for a second. The average king-size mattress you sleep on is about 6 feet 7 inches. This bed is more than double that length. You could park a small car on this thing. And the Bible doesn't mention it as legend. It doesn't frame it as myth or metaphor. The text says this bed still existed at the time of writing. It says you could go see it yourself on display in the Ammonite city of Rabbah, like an artifact in a museum. The bed belonged to a king named Og, and Og ruled a kingdom called Bashan. Now, if you've heard of Og at all, it was probably in passing. Maybe a Sunday school lesson about Moses conquering kingdoms before entering the Promised Land. Maybe a footnote in a study Bible. He gets about 2 minutes in most sermons, if that. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Og wasn't just some random king the Israelites defeated on their way to Canaan. The Hebrew text calls him something very specific. It calls him the last remnant of the Rephaim. And that word, Rephaim, is where this entire story cracks wide open. Because the Rephaim weren't just tall people. They weren't just a tribe that happened to produce some large warriors. In the original Hebrew, the Rephaim are described as something far more unsettling. They appear in multiple books of the Bible, sometimes as a living ethnic group occupying real territory, and sometimes in passages like Isaiah chapter 26 and the Psalms as the shades of the dead dwelling in the underworld. The same word, the same people, used for both the living and the dead. English translations can't handle that, so they pick one meaning and throw the other away. Your Bible might say giants in one verse and the dead 3 chapters later, and you'd never know the Hebrew word underneath is identical. What if the giant clans of the Bible didn't actually disappear? What if they scattered, assimilated, and showed up again in some of the most famous stories in Scripture, and we just never connected the dots? Stick with me, because this goes deeper than you think. The region of Bashan sits in what is today the Golan Heights, that disputed plateau between modern Israel, Syria, and Jordan. If you've seen it on the news, you know it as a military flashpoint. Rocky terrain, volcanic soil, strategic high ground. But 3,000 years ago, this was one of the most fertile and prosperous regions in the ancient Near East. The prophet Amos talks about the cows of Bashan, fat and well-fed. Psalm 22 describes the bulls of Bashan as symbols of overwhelming strength. Ezekiel references Bashan's oak trees as the finest timber available. This wasn't wasteland. This was prime real estate. And Og controlled all of it. Deuteronomy chapter 3 gives us the inventory. 60 cities, all fortified, high walls, gates, bronze bars, plus countless unwalled villages scattered across the countryside. This was a kingdom, not a campsite. A civilization with infrastructure, agriculture, military defenses, and trade networks. The text says Og ruled from 2 capital cities, Ashtaroth and Edrei. Ashtaroth is identified by most scholars with Tel Ashtara in modern Syria. Edrei matches up with the city of Daraa, just across the Syrian border from Jordan. These are real places. You can visit them, and both cities sit on top of something remarkable. Beneath Edrei lies a massive underground city carved from volcanic basalt. Tunnels, chambers, streets, entire neighborhoods cut into the rock. Archaeologists estimate it could have housed thousands of people. Some of the doorways and ceiling heights in the oldest sections are significantly taller than what you'd expect for average-sized inhabitants. Now, I want to be careful here. Tall doorways don't prove giants lived there. Ancient architecture varied for all kinds of reasons, but when you combine the physical evidence with what the text explicitly states, the picture starts getting very interesting, because the Bible isn't shy about this. Numbers chapter 13 records the famous spy mission into Canaan. 12 scouts go in, 10 come back terrified. And what do they say? "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The descendants of Anak, the Anakim, and Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 11 connects them directly to our story. It says the Anakim were considered Rephaim, same word used for Og's people, same ethnic classification. So you've got the Anakim in Hebron, down in the southern hill country. You've got Og and the Rephaim up in Bashan, in the northern plateau. And the text explicitly tells you these groups are related. They're branches of the same family tree. This wasn't one freak occurrence of unusually large people in one isolated village. The Bible describes a network of giant clans spread across the entire land of Canaan, from the far north to the deep south. And Israel was told to march straight into the middle of it. Think about what that means for a moment. You're a former slave. You just spent 40 years wandering through desert. Your parents' generation died out because they were too afraid to enter this land the first time. And now God is telling you to pick a fight with a king whose bed is 13.5 feet long, who controls 60 fortified cities, whose people are described in terms so terrifying that your own scouts compared themselves to insects. That's not a footnote. That's the setup for one of the most dramatic confrontations in the entire Old Testament. And the resolution is almost anticlimactic. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 3. "So the Lord our God also gave into our hands Og king of Bashan and all his army. We struck them down, leaving no survivors." One verse. That's it. A kingdom that had dominated the region for centuries, wiped out in a single sentence. The text moves on to dividing up the land among the tribes of Israel, like it's filling out paperwork after the real story is over. But was Og's kingdom really wiped out completely? The text says Israel left no survivors in that battle. But the Rephaim, as a people, did they actually vanish from the earth that day? Because if you keep reading, you start finding traces of them in the most unexpected places. Let's talk about that Hebrew word, Rephaim. Because understanding this word is like finding a key that unlocks rooms in the Bible you didn't know existed. In Hebrew, the word is spelled Resh P Aleph Yod Mem, Rephaim, and it shows up in the Old Testament in two completely different contexts that, on the surface, seem to have nothing to do with each other. Context number one, the one we've already been discussing, the Rephaim as a people group, a physical, historical population of large-statured humans who lived in Canaan before the Israelites arrived. Genesis chapter 14 mentions them in the time of Abraham, when a coalition of kings defeated the Rephaim at Ashtaroth-Karnaim, the same city that would later become Og's capital. They were already there, already established, running a kingdom centuries before Israel existed as a nation. Deuteronomy chapter 2 gives a quick geography lesson. It tells you the Rephaim once lived in the territory that would become Moab, but the Moabites called them Emim. They also lived in the territory that would become Ammon, but the Ammonites called them Zamzumim. Different names, same people. Every nation in the region had its own word for these giant clans, which tells you something important. The Rephaim were so widespread that every culture in the area had to develop vocabulary to describe them. That's context one: real people, real places, real battles. Context number two is where things get strange. The same word, Rephaim, appears in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah to describe the dead, specifically the inhabitants of Sheol, the Hebrew underworld. Job chapter 26, verse 5. The Rephaim tremble beneath the waters and their inhabitants. The King James translates this as, dead things are formed from under the waters. But the Hebrew word there is Rephaim. Proverbs chapter 9, verse 18. But he does not know that the Rephaim are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. Most English versions translate this as the dead are there. But again, Hebrew says Rephaim. Isaiah chapter 26, verse 14. The dead will not live, the Rephaim will not rise. And then, just 5 verses later in verse 19, a reversal. Your dead will live, their Rephaim will rise. Same chapter, same word. Used to talk about what happens after death, using the exact same term that in other books describes a very specific ethnic group that occupied the land of Canaan. Now, most scholars handle this in one of two ways. Camp 1 says these are completely separate words that just happen to look the same. A coincidence of Hebrew spelling. Camp 2 says the connection is intentional, that the ancient Hebrews associated the giant clans with the realm of the dead because of their perceived connection to the pre-flood world, to the Nephilim tradition of Genesis chapter 6. And that second interpretation opens up something fascinating, because if the Rephaim carried a dual identity in the Hebrew imagination, as both a physical people and a kind of spiritual category connected to the underworld, then every passage about them takes on an additional dimension. When Israel goes to war against Og, they're not just fighting a tall king with a big army. In the theological framework of the text, they're confronting something that exists on the boundary between the natural and the supernatural, between the living world and the world of the dead. The root of the word gives us even more to work with. The Hebrew root RPH carries the idea of being slack, weak, or sinking down. It's related to the word Rapha, which can mean to heal, but also to relax, to let go, to sink into weakness. Some linguists argue that the Rephaim were literally the sunken ones, or the fallen ones, a name that connects them both to their alleged origin as descendants of the fallen beings in Genesis 6, and to their destination, the depths of Sheol. And here's where it gets personal, because this dual meaning isn't just an academic curiosity. It actually changes how you read certain passages. Take the Valley of Rephaim. This is a real geographic location just south of Jerusalem. David fought the Philistines there twice, as recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 5. But the name itself, Emek Rephaim, the Valley of the Rephaim, carries both meanings simultaneously. It's a valley named after the giant clan that once inhabited it, and it's a valley whose name literally means the Valley of the Shades, the Valley of the Dead. David fought his enemies in a place whose very name declared that death and giants occupied the same ground. Think about what that means for you personally for a second. Every difficult season you've walked through, every valley in your life carries a name. And sometimes that name carries more weight than you realize. The valley you're in right now, whatever you call it, anxiety, grief, financial ruin, betrayal, that name has meaning. And the Bible's approach to valleys isn't to avoid them, it's to fight in them. David didn't go around the valley of Rephaim, he won his battle in it. There's another passage that unlocks once you know the Hebrew, Genesis chapter 14, verse 5. This is the account of the Battle of the Kings, one of the earliest military campaigns recorded in Scripture. A coalition of 4 eastern kings marches into Canaan and defeats several local populations. And look who's on the list. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings allied with him came and defeated the Rephaim at Ashtaroth-Karnaim. Ashtaroth-Karnaim, Og's future capital. The Rephaim are already there, already fighting wars, already significant enough to be named in an international military campaign, all the way back in Abraham's lifetime. This isn't a late addition to the biblical narrative. The Rephaim are embedded in the oldest stories of Genesis, and the name Ashtaroth-Karnaim itself is worth pausing on. Karnaim means 2 horns in Hebrew, Ashtaroth of the 2 horns. Some scholars connect this to the worship of Ashtoreth, the Canaanite fertility goddess often depicted with horns. If that association is correct, then Og's capital city was named after a pagan deity, and the Rephaim were deeply embedded in the religious landscape of pre-Israelite Canaan. This means the Rephaim weren't just a military threat, they were a theological one, a civilization built on worship systems that stood in direct opposition to the God of Israel. When you read your English Bible, all of this disappears. The translators pick giants or the dead, depending on context, and you never realize the same word is threading through the text like a recurring motif, connecting stories of physical warfare to questions about death, the afterlife, and what lies beneath the surface of the visible world. That's what gets lost in translation. Not just vocabulary, an entire theological layer. And it matters, because the Bible isn't just telling you that Israel fought some big guys and won. It's telling you something about the nature of the enemy, something about what it means to face an adversary that seems to exist on a different scale than you do, an opponent connected to death itself. If that sounds dramatic, good. The original text is dramatic. We just stopped reading it that way. Now, with that Hebrew foundation in place, let me show you what the actual ground looks like, because the land where Og ruled, the territory of Bashan, holds physical evidence that matches the biblical description in ways that are hard to dismiss. There's a place on the Golan Heights, about 10 miles east of the Sea of Galilee, that most tourists never visit. It's not on the standard Holy Land pilgrimage route. There are no gift shops, no tour buses, no visitor centers with air conditioning and a short film. What you'll find instead is a circle of stones, a massive one, 5 concentric rings of basalt boulders stacked without mortar, the outermost ring measuring over 500 feet in diameter. At the center sits a 15-foot-tall cairn of piled rocks. The total weight of the structure has been estimated at over 40,000 tons. The locals call it Rujm el-Hiri. In Arabic, that means the stone heap of the wildcat. Israeli archaeologists call it Gilgal Rephaim, the wheel of the giants. And nobody knows with certainty who built it or why. What we do know is this. The structure dates to the early Bronze Age, somewhere between 3000 and 2700 BCE. That places its construction roughly 1,000 years before Moses and the Israelites arrived in the region. Whoever built it was part of the pre-Israelite population of Bashan, exactly the population the Bible associates with the Rephaim. Some researchers have compared it to Stonehenge, and the comparison isn't crazy. Like Stonehenge, the rings at Rujum El Hiri appear to have astronomical alignments. The entrance to the structure faces northeast, aligned with the summer solstice sunrise. Two openings in the walls correspond to the spring and autumn equinoxes. This wasn't a random pile of rocks. This was engineered, planned, positioned with precision relative to celestial movements. It required a massive labor force, sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, and a level of social organization that doesn't match the primitive nomads picture many people have of pre-Israelite Canaan. And it's not alone. Scattered across the Golan Heights and into the broader Bashan region are over 700 dolmens. These are megalithic burial structures, basically giant stone tables made from two or more upright slabs supporting a massive capstone. Some of the capstones weigh over 50 tons, 700 of them in one region. For comparison, all of Britain has about 800 dolmens. The Bashan region has nearly as many in a fraction of the geographical area. The largest concentration of dolmens anywhere in the Middle East sits in the territory the Bible assigns to King Og of Bashan. Now, dolmens are found all over the world. They're a prehistoric building tradition that spans cultures and continents. Their presence in Bashan doesn't automatically prove giants built them. People of normal stature were perfectly capable of moving large stones using log rollers, ramps, and organized labor. But here's what's interesting. The biblical text doesn't just say Og was big. It says his kingdom had extraordinary building projects, 60 fortified cities, walls, gates, defenses. And the archaeological record shows that the Bashan region does, in fact, contain an unusual density of massive stone construction dating to the pre-Israelite period. The text and the ground agree. Someone built impressive things in Bashan long before Israel got there. There's another site worth mentioning. At Tel Ashtara, the location identified with Og's capital city of Ashtaroth, excavations have revealed occupation layers going back to the 3rd millennium BCE. The site sits at a strategic crossroads where major trade routes intersected, exactly where you'd expect a dominant kingdom to plant its capital. And beneath the modern Syrian village of Deraa, at the site identified with Og's other capital, Edrei, those underground tunnels I mentioned earlier extend for a remarkable distance. Some estimates suggest the subterranean city covers over a square kilometer. The oldest sections feature construction techniques consistent with Bronze Age building practices. An underground city beneath a capital associated with the last king of the Rephaim, doorways and chambers carved from volcanic basalt, some portions with ceiling heights exceeding what later periods considered standard. I want to be clear about what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. I'm not saying this proves the existence of biological giants who were 13 feet tall. Archaeology works with physical evidence, and oversized bones of confirmed giant humans have not been recovered from these specific sites in peer-reviewed contexts. What I am saying is this: the Bible describes a formidable pre-Israelite civilization in Bashan with impressive fortifications and infrastructure. The archaeology of the Golan Heights confirms that a well-organized pre-Israelite civilization existed in that region with impressive fortifications and infrastructure. The megalithic building tradition in the area is remarkably dense. The sites named in the Bible as Og's capitals correspond to real archaeological tells with deep occupation histories. Whether the Rephaim were literally enormous or whether giant carries a wider semantic range in ancient Semitic languages, describing people who were larger than average but also feared and culturally dominant, the footprint they left on the landscape is undeniable. And there's something else the stones tell us, something about timing. The dolmens and the Ruj Melhiri structure predate Israel's arrival by centuries, which means whoever built them was living in Bashan long before Moses showed up. The Bible places the Rephaim in the region going back to the time of Abraham, Genesis chapter 14. The archaeological dating of the megalithic structures is consistent with that timeline. Consider what that means practically. When archaeologists carbon date organic material found near these structures, the dates cluster in the 3rd millennium BCE. When the biblical text places the Rephaim at Ashtaroth Karnim in Genesis 14, the narrative timeline puts Abraham in roughly the early 2nd millennium BCE, perhaps around 2000 to 1800 BCE, depending on your chronological framework. The structures were already old when Abraham walked through the region. So when Moses encounters Og, he's not fighting some upstart warlord who recently moved into the area. He's facing the king of a civilization that has been rooted in that land for 1,000 years. A civilization whose monuments still stand, even after the people who built them are gone. There's a particular dolmen site near the town of Gamla on the Golan Heights that illustrates this well. The dolmen there has a capstone estimated to weigh over 50 tons, and the burial chamber beneath it was carved to accommodate what appears to be a high-status individual. The structure sits on a ridge overlooking the Sea of Galilee, positioned as if whoever was buried there wanted to watch over the land, even in death. The Rephaim as the guardians of the dead. The Rephaim as the inhabitants of Sheol. The Rephaim buried beneath megalithic stones that look down on the living world from elevated ridges. The dual meaning of the Hebrew word is written into the landscape itself. And here's something worth sitting with. These stones have survived longer than almost every empire that tried to control the region after the Rephaim disappeared. The Israelites came and went. The Assyrians came and went. The Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. The Crusaders built castles nearby. The Ottomans taxed the villages. The modern militaries of Israel and Syria fought over the Golan in living memory. Through all of it, the stones stayed. Whatever the Rephaim were, whatever they built, it outlasted everything that came after. That raises the question we've been building toward since the beginning of this video. When Israel defeated Og and took his territory, what happened to his people? Did the Rephaim really disappear? Or did they go somewhere else? The Bible says Israel defeated Og, leaving no survivors. Deuteronomy chapter 3 makes that clear. But here's the thing about ancient warfare. Leaving no survivors in a specific battle is not the same as erasing an entire ethnic group from the face of the earth. And the Bible itself gives us the receipts. Joshua chapter 13, verse 12. This is after the conquest. Joshua is dividing up the land, and the text pauses to note that Og was the last of the Rephaim. He was the last of the Rephaim in Bashan, the last king of that particular dynasty. But just a few chapters earlier, in Joshua chapter 11, verses 21 and 22, there's a passage that rarely gets quoted in sermons about giants. It says, Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah and Israel. Joshua destroyed them completely with their cities. And then this line, no Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Read that again slowly. The giant clans were removed from Israelite territory, but they survived in 3 specific cities, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod. If those names sound familiar, they should. Those are Philistine cities. 3 of the 5 major cities of the Philistine Pentapolis, the great coastal confederation that would become Israel's most persistent enemy for the next several centuries. The Anakim, the people the text explicitly identifies as Rephaim, found refuge among the Philistines. And suddenly the most famous giant story in the Bible takes on an entirely different dimension. 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Valley of Elah. A young shepherd named David walks onto a battlefield where the entire Israelite army has been paralyzed for 40 days by a single warrior, Goliath of Gath. Gath, one of the 3 cities where the Anakim survived. The text says Goliath stood 6 cubits and a span. If you're using the standard cubit of about 18 inches, that puts him at roughly 9 feet 6 inches. Some manuscripts of the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, give a shorter measurement of 4 cubits and a span, which would place him closer to 6 feet 9 inches, still unusually tall, but within the range of known human variation. Either way, the point isn't just his height, it's his pedigree. Goliath comes from Gath. The Anakim retreated to Gath. The Anakim were Rephaim. Goliath is a descendant of the same giant tradition that produced King Og of Bashan. David wasn't just fighting a big guy. He was fighting the legacy of an ancient lineage that had been terrifying Israel since before they entered the Promised Land. And the details the text gives about Goliath reinforce this connection. His armor weighs 5,000 shekels of bronze, roughly 125 pounds. His spear tip alone weighs 600 shekels of iron, about 15 pounds. He wears greaves of bronze on his legs. A javelin of bronze hangs between his shoulders. He has a shield bearer walking ahead of him. This isn't a warrior. This is a walking fortress. And the Hebrew text describes his approach with a specific word. He came out of the Philistine camp using language that echoes a champion ritual known from ancient Near Eastern warfare, where one representative fighter from each side would determine the outcome of the entire battle. The Philistines knew exactly what they were doing. They sent their Rephaim descendant, the biggest, most heavily armed warrior they had, to demoralize Israel. And for 40 days, it worked. The entire army of the living God cowered in their tents because of one man. 40 days. The same number of days the spies spent in Canaan before coming back, terrified of the Anakim. The same number of years Israel wandered in the wilderness because they feared the giants. The text is echoing itself. Another generation, another giant, another test of faith. And then David shows up. Not a soldier, a shepherd, the youngest son, the one nobody invited to the battle. And he asks the question that nobody else will ask. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? David reframes the entire situation with one sentence. Everyone else was calculating the odds. David was calculating the offense. The giant isn't just big, he's defying God, and that changes the equation entirely. And the story doesn't end with Goliath. 2 Samuel chapter 21 verses 15 through 22 describes a series of battles between David's warriors and Philistine giants. 4 additional giants from Gath are named, and each one is described as being born to the giant, using the Hebrew phrase Yalad Laharapha, born of Rapha. Rapha, the singular form of Rephaim. One of them, Ishbi-Benob, carried a spear weighing 300 bronze shekels and wore a new sword, and he nearly killed David himself. The text says David was exhausted, that his lamp was almost snuffed out. His men had to step in to save him. Abishai struck down Ishbi-Benob and rescued the king. After that, David's men swore an oath that he would never go into battle with them again, because they couldn't risk losing the lamp of Israel. That detail is devastating when you think about it. The greatest giant killer in biblical history, the man who took down Goliath as a teenager, almost died fighting another Rephaim warrior in his later years. The giants didn't get easier to fight as David got older. They got harder. His body was aging. His strength was fading. The very thing that had defined his career, confronting impossible enemies with faith, became something his men had to protect him from. There's something deeply human about that. The battles change shape as you age, but they don't go away. Another of the Gath giants, Saph, is described simply as being among the descendants of Rephaim. A third had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 digits in total, a detail so specific and bizarre that it reads like an eyewitness account. You don't invent a detail like that. Someone saw it and remembered it. The fourth, Lami, was the brother of Goliath, and his spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, the same description used for Goliath's weapon in 1 Samuel 17. All 4 were from Gath. All 4 were descendants of Rephaim, and all 4 were eventually killed by David's elite warriors, his mighty men. 2 Samuel 21, verse 22, sums it up. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Notice the language. By the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. David killed one. His men killed the rest. Giant killing isn't a solo activity. It's communal. David didn't defeat the Rephaim alone. He built a team of people who shared his faith and fought alongside him. There's a lesson in that, and we'll come back to it. So let me lay out the timeline for you. The Rephaim occupy Canaan from at least the time of Abraham. Og rules as the last Rephaim king in Bashan. Moses defeats Og, but the Anakim branch of the Rephaim survive in the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Generations later, these descendants emerge from Gath to challenge Israel again. David kills Goliath. David's men kill 4 more Rephaim warriors from the same city. This isn't scattered mythology. It's a continuous narrative thread that runs from Genesis through 2 Samuel. The Rephaim don't disappear. They relocate. They integrate into Philistine culture. They emerge again and again as military champions representing the same ancient threat. And here's where this gets really interesting from a theological perspective. Because if the Bible is deliberately tracking this bloodline across centuries, there has to be a reason. The text doesn't waste words on things that don't matter, so why does it keep circling back to the giants? Pay attention to the pattern. Every time Israel faces a critical test of faith, a moment where their courage and trust in God is on the line, there's a Rephaim descendant standing in the way. The spies at Kadesh Barnea, they saw the Nephilim, the Anakim, and refused to enter the land. An entire generation died in the wilderness because the giants scared them into disobedience. Moses at the Jordan. Before Israel can enter the promised land from the east, they have to go through Og, the last Rephaim king. God tells Moses not to fear him, and the victory becomes the proof that God can deliver on his promises. David at the Valley of Elah. He's an anointed king who hasn't yet taken his throne. The entire establishment, Saul and his army, are frozen with fear. David steps forward and defeats Goliath, and it's the beginning of everything that follows. See the pattern? The giants function as a barometer of faith. When Israel fears the giants more than they trust God, they fail. When they face the giants with faith, they succeed. That's not coincidence. That's architecture. The biblical authors are using the Rephaim as a recurring literary and theological device to measure the spiritual condition of God's people. If you're finding this breakdown useful, hit subscribe. We cover biblical mysteries like this every week, digging into the Hebrew text and the archaeological record to find what gets missed in the standard Sunday morning version. Now, there's one more piece of this story that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most relevant one for your life right now. Here's something I want you to sit with for a minute. The book of Numbers tells us that when the 12 spies went into Canaan, all 12 of them saw the same giants. All 12 of them saw the same fortified cities, the same massive inhabitants, the same overwhelming military reality, same intel, same evidence, same situation. 10 of them said, "We can't do it. They're too big. We are like grasshoppers." 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, "Let's go. God is with us. They're bread for us." Same giants, completely opposite conclusions. And the difference wasn't intelligence. The 10 spies weren't stupid. Their military assessment was probably accurate. From a purely tactical standpoint, an army of former slaves taking on fortified cities defended by oversized warriors was insane. The 10 spies were being rational. Joshua and Caleb weren't being irrational. They were operating from a different framework. They factored God into the equation, and that changed the math entirely. That's the pattern the Bible establishes with the Rephaim, and it's the pattern that's still running in your life right now. Because you have giants. You do. They don't carry bronze spears or stand 9 feet tall, but they're just as real. They're the situation that feels too big, too entrenched, too fortified for you to overcome. The diagnosis, the debt, the relationship that fell apart, the addiction you can't seem to break, the dream that everyone around you says is impossible. And just like the 12 spies, you have a choice about how you interpret what's in front of you. You can look at the giant and say, "I'm a grasshopper," or you can look at the same giant and say, "This is where God shows up." That's why the Bible tracks the Rephaim across centuries. It's not because the ancient Hebrews were obsessed with tall people. It's because every generation faces its own version of the same test. The obstacle that looks too large, the enemy with more resources than you, the wall you've been staring at for months. Moses faced his giant at the threshold of the Promised Land. David faced his in the Valley of Elah. And here's what's interesting about both of those encounters. God didn't remove the giant before they got there. He didn't shrink Og. He didn't make Goliath average height. The giant was still giant-sized when they walked up to it. The victory wasn't that the obstacle became smaller. The victory was that their perspective became bigger. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 2. God tells Moses, "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hands, him and all his people and his land." Past tense. God says, "I have delivered," as if the battle is already won, before Moses lifts a single sword. The outcome was determined before the fight started. David said something similar. 1 Samuel 17, verse 46. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand." Same confidence, same past tense certainty about a future event. If you're going through something right now that feels like a giant standing in your valley, blocking your path, making you feel like a grasshopper, I want you to hear what the original Hebrew is doing in these passages. The verb in Deuteronomy 3:2 is natati, from the root natan, to give. God says, "I have given him into your hand." It's not a promise for later. It's a completed act described in advance. In the Hebrew verb system, this is called the prophetic perfect. It describes a future action as if it has already occurred, because from God's perspective, it has. The battle with your giant has already been decided. You just haven't walked onto the field yet. That's what the village of the giants is really about. Not just a kingdom in Bashan, Not just megalithic stones on the Golan Heights. Not just a Hebrew word with two meanings. It's about the test that every person faces. The moment when the thing in front of you is bigger than you are, and you have to decide whether to factor God into the equation or not. Israel learned this the hard way. The generation that refused to face the giants died in the wilderness. They never saw the promised land. Their children, the ones who watched their parents' fear destroy them, those children crossed the Jordan and conquered Bashan and took Jericho and settled the land. Same family, same God, different response to the giant. And look at what happened to Caleb specifically, because his story is one of the most underrated narratives in the entire Old Testament. Caleb was one of the two spies who said yes. 45 years later in Joshua chapter 14, Caleb is 85 years old, and he walks up to Joshua and says, "Give me the hill country of Hebron, the place where the Anakim live, the place that terrified everyone else." He's 85. He could ask for flat farmland near a river, something easy, something comfortable. Instead, he asks for the mountain fortress where the giants still live. Joshua 14, verse 12. Caleb says, "Perhaps the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, just as the Lord said." And then he goes up, and he takes Hebron, and he drives out the 3 sons of Anak, the descendants of the Rephaim. At 85, after waiting 45 years, he circled back to the exact thing that scared everyone else and claimed it. That's what faith looks like when it has patience. Caleb didn't rush. He waited decades, but he never stopped believing the mountain was his. And when the time came, he didn't ask for a substitute. He asked for the hardest fight available, because that's where the promise was. What's your Hebron? What's the mountain you've been circling for years? The one you know is yours, but you haven't climbed yet, because the giants on it look too big. Caleb at 85 says the giants don't get a vote on your future. God already decided. And then David, generations later, facing the same bloodline, the same Rephaim descendants, walking into the same kind of impossible situation, and he runs toward it. 1 Samuel 17, verse 48, says David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet Goliath. He didn't walk, he didn't creep, he ran. There's something about confronting the thing you're most afraid of that changes you. The Bible doesn't frame it as recklessness, it frames it as worship. David declared the name of God on that battlefield. He said, "The battle is the Lord's." And then he picked up a stone and threw it. Faith and action, declaration and follow-through, theology and a sling. And remember what we discovered earlier about David's mighty men. They killed the remaining giants together. Abishai saved David's life. Elhanan struck down Lami. Sibbecai killed Saph. Jonathan, David's nephew, brought down the 6-fingered giant. These weren't solo missions. David built a community of giant killers around him. You were not designed to fight your battles alone. The Bible doesn't glorify isolated heroism. It glorifies faithful communities. David had his mighty men. Moses had Joshua. Caleb had the tribe of Judah behind him. Whoever is in your corner, whoever fights alongside you, whoever refuses to let you face the thing alone, that person is playing the role of Abishai in your story. And if you haven't found your Abishai yet, maybe that's the first step. Not climbing the mountain, finding the people who will climb it with you. The village of the giants isn't just ancient history. The Rephaim scattered out of Bashan and into the Philistine coast and into the valley of Elah and into the pages of Isaiah's prophecy about the dead. They wove themselves through the entire story of Israel because they were the recurring test, the perpetual question God kept putting in front of his people. Will you trust me when the enemy is bigger than you? That question hasn't expired. The Hebrew is the same. The test is the same. The God who said, Natati, I have given him into your hand, is the same. The only variable is your response. Let me leave you with one more piece of the text. After David and his men killed those 4 giants from Gath in 2 Samuel 21, the passage ends. No celebration, no parade, just a quiet statement of fact. They fell, and then the narrative moves on. That's how giant killing works in the Bible. It's not the climax, it's the gateway. The giant is what stood between David and the next chapter of his story. Once it fell, life continued. Bigger, more expansive, more fully what it was meant to be. Your giant is standing between you and your next chapter. And 3,000 years of Hebrew text, archaeological evidence, and theological witness all say the same thing. The bed was real. The stones still stand. The battle has already been decided. Walk onto the field. YouTube thinks you'll want to see this video next. It's about another biblical mystery that changes how you read the entire Old Testament. Click it now, and if you made it this far, subscribe. We go this deep every single week.